There will be then a point when Putin cannot continue. And what I suspect here is that also now this enormous pressure that is being made in Pokrovsk, in the Donetsk basin, is related to perhaps the impression in Moscow that time is running out.
I'm joined today by Andreas Umland, an analyst at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So there's been reports from a range of sources which have revealed Putin's spending has exceeded Russia's revenue by over 15 billion in the first 10 months of this year. That budget deficit is expected to grow from 1.6% to 2.6% in just the last 2 months of 2025. Can you quickly just break down what's driving this economic loss?
Well, obviously that is all or almost all a result of the war and the various repercussions of the war. Much of the Russian industry is now working in one way or another for the war. And there are also the effects of the sanctions and the effects not only of the sanctions from the Western countries, but also of the peculiar sanctions that Ukraine is imposing on Russia by way of bombarding industrial infrastructure, in particular refineries and other energy-related infrastructure. And that is now having a sort of a cumulative effect. I think, however, the largest, perhaps, reason for all of that is that simply the Russian economy is, as I mentioned at the beginning, now to a large extent geared towards the war, and the war doesn't, of course, create any wealth. There are some gains from the war, like the grain, for instance, from Ukraine that Russia is capturing and then selling and getting some income from that. But this is rather the exception. As a whole, this war is, of course, a huge loss, not only for the country in general, but also for the economy in particular. And the so-called special military operation was from the beginning not planned this way. It was all about a war of a few weeks in which then supposedly Russia would capture Kiev and then impose its own peculiar peace on Ukraine, and that would have been it. And now it's sort of improvising not too bad, one has to say, in view of the many sanctions. Russia has been very creative in circumventing them and has gotten a lot of support from, especially from China, but also from other countries, unfortunately also countries like India, and even from a number of Western companies who have simply used the various way to circumvent the sanctions to still get their exports into Russia. But now this is all coming seemingly finally to an end, all this circumvention and all these improvisation. And now the reality starts to bite Russia.
We've seen Trump reiterate his claims that India will stop buying Russian oil, which now appears to be backed up by reports which I've read, which say that the 5 largest Indian oil refineries have not placed any orders for Russian oil from December onwards. What sort of how much of Russia's economy was dependent on these? Well, on Indian purchases of Russian oil, and what do you expect this shift from India to mean for Russia's economy?
I think it is certainly a complication. I don't have now the exact numbers in front of me, but this share of Russian oils sold to India was apparently very large. And if now this is really reduced to a significant amount, we'll still have to see what it actually then materially means. Then that would be a blow for Russian foreign trade. Although, again, one has to be also here skeptical in the way that so far Russia has been very creative in circumventing these sanctions. And I'm not excluding that Moscow will again find ways to compensate for this loss, or at least partly compensate. So we will have to wait for the effects of it, and whether this is then really something turning into a recession or perhaps even depression of the Russian economy.
Sort of jumped into my next question already, which is what state would the Russian economy need to be in for it to prompt Putin to sue for peace? Is that something that can really be achieved? And are we headed in that direction now with for example, India tailing back its purchases of Russian oil?
So far, I think nobody, maybe an economist would be able to calculate that already, but I think there are so many political factors here that it's very difficult to predict what this will all come to, whether we are looking now into perhaps a period of, let's say, several months that will then already lead to a critical situation for the Russian economy, or whether we are still talking here about a war that will last another year, another 2 or 3 years, or something like that. So that is so far difficult to say, because many things are changing at the same time in many ways on the front line, in the international economy and in the international trade of Russia. But I think there will be then a point when Putin cannot continue. And what I suspect here is that also now this enormous pressure that is being made in Pokrovsk, in the Donetsk basin, is related to perhaps the impression in Moscow that time is running out. And there was perhaps in earlier periods of this war the feeling in Moscow that time is on Russia's side. But now I wouldn't say it's on Ukraine's side, but it's also not any longer in Russia's side in the same way that perhaps that was the case a year or two ago. But now my feeling is that this enormous pressure and the readiness also for Moscow to go to such length and also to basically stomach so many victims of these attacks in the Donetsk basin, in the Donbass, is perhaps related to the fact that they want to somehow come to a closure with that, and that they then can present, by they I mean the Putin leadership, can then present to the Russian population a picture that then could be sold as a sort of victory of Russia, and then perhaps Putin would be ready for a ceasefire. That is my interpretation. It's speculative. I don't have any sort of primary sources for that. It's sort of rather a synthesis, one could say, of different observations from Western behavior, Russian behavior, the front line, the economic situation. But that would be my current sort of prognosis, what is going to happen.
Just so I'm clear, you think that if Pokrovsk can be taken by Russian forces, you think that might then be a step at which Putin comes for peace?
That is difficult to say. He certainly wants to have more. The question is whether he can have still the capability to go for more. And the capture of Pokrovsk would give him two ways to go ahead. Either to then use this operational, let's call it that way, advantage to push further into Ukraine and to then capture, for instance, the whole of the Donbass, and that means the remaining parts of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts that Russia has not yet captured, and perhaps even go further east into, let's say, the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, or then perhaps to declare victory and then to say, well, now we are ready for a ceasefire. That may be something that is now being discussed in Moscow because of the accumulating economic problems and the hard hits that the Ukrainian rocket forces, missile forces, and drones have been able to land in various industrial infrastructure. So they may be under pressure now to come here to some sort of closure, or at least to interrupt the war for a while. And that may be also one of the drivers of this offensive in Pokrovsk.
Shifting on to those sort of economic pressures you were talking about, and to shift back onto those economic pressures you were just talking about, we can assume that a lot of the impact we're seeing on the Russian economy has been from the recent sanctions. The sort of accelerating nature of Russia's economic downturn has been from the sanctions from Trump. But there was a lot of talk at the time when they were announced that there might be some backfire for the American or European markets. Are we seeing any evidence of that?
I'm not aware of any so far, and in general I found this whole discussion, we had a sub-discussions of this in Germany about the allegedly very important role of Russian gas for the German economy, and that there's no way Germany can live without this Russian gas. And then it all turned out to be just vastly overblown. Certainly 2022 was a complicated year for the German economy, because the gas imports via the pipelines from Russia broke down. But Germany has managed this situation, and that is not a comparable, of course, case here for the whole Western economy and the world economy, and the effects that the sanctions may have then on the broader trade with oil over the planet. But my suspicion is here also that these effects are overstated, and that the world economy can also do without Russian oil, and certainly it will feel the effects if the sanctions really work the way that they should, but it will not be devastating or anything really that significant that we would have to fear.
Well, Andreas Umland, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.